Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I want to take just a moment to introduce myself, and thanks to those that are in the room and those that are online. It's nice to have the opportunity to introduce yourself. You get to control what people say. I remember speaking at a conference a few years ago and being introduced by somebody who finished off by suggesting that I was the proud father of a 10-year-old girl, which was news to me. So, so it's nice sometimes to have a more relaxed approach to these things. I think I'm here today because of a couple of hats that I wear. I come from a small coastal community in Canada. It is not an island except in bad weather. It's a peninsula that extends out into the Bay of Fundy in the Atlantic Ocean. My family comes from a fishing village of about 200 people. They've been fishing there for about 250 years on one side of the family and for about 2,500 years on the other side of the family. So I feel that I have one foot in coastal communities and in the challenges that climate change is bringing to us. The other side of my background, though, I'm an entrepreneur, and I've ended up at the University of Waterloo in Canada as their entrepreneur in residence to work with young students who are trying to commercialize their ideas related to green entrepreneurship and environmental entrepreneurship. In my own entrepreneurial journey, I sold my last company about 5 years ago, and so this has led me into thinking about issues like philanthropy and how do entrepreneurs kind of share the benefits of what they've received through their ventures and their initiatives and their efforts over time back to the communities that they've often come from or worked with. And so these ideas combined in this session, we want to explore that notion of philanthropy, of the financial means that we can kind of use to help communities, but in the context particularly of what it means in relation to climate change in coastal communities. And we originally had a bit of a larger panel that was planned for this event, including Parnasha Banerjee from India, who is going to be joining us. Unfortunately, she's not here, but it means that I get to spend more time with our main guest for today's session, Benjamin Belagie, who is the CEO of Wings, an organization that we will find out a little bit more about over the next 35 minutes or so. What I'd like to do is, rather than sort of, dive into all of this too formally, is just have a bit of a discussion, share some ideas and some opportunities to kind of think through these issues in more detail. But Benjamin, maybe I could start by asking, I've shared some of my background, maybe I could get you to start by sharing some of your personal background, where you came from, why these issues came to be important to you, and we'll come to Wings and some of those other issues in a few minutes' time.
Well, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Brian. And so I'm Benjamin Belagie. I'm the executive director of Wings, and I'll introduce the network and what we do in a couple of minutes. But to your question, I also come from a coastal area, but a much more crowded one, the south of France, so Nice. And I've always been very sensitive to environmental issues and more broadly societal issues and the intersection between the two. So I spent my whole career working in different roles and types of organizations, but always somehow at the nexus of sustainable development and environment, economic development, philanthropy, international cooperation, civil society in different parts of the world. So I've worked and lived in Canada, in Ethiopia, in Tunisia. As I said, I'm originally from France, and I'm currently living in São Paulo, Brazil, since 2016, where my organization, Wings, is actually based, although we're global, and we work across the world with members of our team and members of our network in 5 continents. But that's where I live today.
I'm interested, you sort of talked about growing up in a coastal community, and Nice may be bigger than Little River where I came from, but there's this sense that somehow that shapes us. And so you talked about your interest in sustainability, in civil society. Do you think some of that comes in some ways from your experiences living and growing up in a coastal region?
That's a good question, and I think definitely a region where there is access to the natural environment and the possibility to connect to this natural environment. May that be coastal, or there are also mountains just right behind Nice. And so I spent a lot of time as a kid, walking in the mountains and And so that has certainly shaped my sensitivity to these issues. Yeah, absolutely.
Now, you mentioned you're the CEO of Wings, and I think for some of our audience, they may be familiar with that structure, but for others, this will be a new organization, a new venture. So perhaps you could share a little bit of information about how the organization was created and how its role has developed over time.
Yes, and well, as I always say, Wings is both almost a dinosaur in the philanthropic space and a startup, because we were created like 25 years ago now, so we've been around for a while. Initially set up as a group of grant makers associations, so networks of foundations from different parts of the world, from Mexico, from the US, from Europe, from Asia, that came together back in '98 and started sharing ideas. How does philanthropy look like in your region? What can we learn from each other as networks? But what we're doing now as a network that has grown tremendously and diversified tremendously is also very new, in the sense that for a long time, I think we were focused on building a community of philanthropic support organizations and foundations that were interested in sharing knowledge and sort of being more effective at what they were doing. But since a few years now, we've really decided to leverage this network, including in the context of the climate emergency, in the context of what we're now considering as a global polycrisis, so an intersection of many massive, sometimes existential threats for the whole humanity, that we had sort of a duty as a network to play a more proactive role in bringing about change and not just being a good space for learning. So today the network has 220 members in 60 countries. A good part of these members are themselves philanthropic networks, so it's a bit of a network of networks, if you wish. And so in the US you have the Council on Foundations. In the Caribbean we have the Caribbean Philanthropy Alliance that was created just a few years ago. We have really members all over the world that bring together different kinds of philanthropic actors, so both like family foundations, corporate foundations, community foundations, and also some other types of support organizations that help channel the resources at the community level. So it's really the broad infrastructure and support system for giving and philanthropy to grow and to be more effective. And when I was saying now we're trying to leverage this network to do more, is that, well, first we realized that indirectly, if we bring all these organizations together, they represent around 100,000 foundations around the world. And we felt like that was an incredibly powerful opportunity to accelerate change in society through transformation of our own field and the practices of philanthropy. And so what we're trying to do today, we have like 3 big pillars of work. One of them is that, well, if we want and we need more private resources, more capital to flow to the SDGs and to climate and other massive issues, we need to create a conducive environment for that, a policy environment that allows for philanthropy to grow, to thrive, easy to register a foundation, easy to send or to receive resources, the whole regulatory environment, which is being which is a big challenge right now in many parts of the world, where we want more private resources, but most of the time governments don't make it easy for these resources to get there. So that's the first piece of work, where we support advocacy. We bring also the collective voice of philanthropy at the UN, at COP, at the OECD, in different spaces, and we really try to bring that diversity, inclusive of the Global South, inclusive of different kinds and types of philanthropy. So that's one area. The other one is more about changing ourselves. What we think is that philanthropy has really a big potential to be an actor of transformation of our systems, not just of charity or helping filling some gaps that were left by governments or left by markets, but that we can, although our resources are very small, I mean, even if you think about some huge foundations like Gates and others, if you bring it all together, it's still like a drop in the bucket compared to the needs, and compared even to public resources or even business resources. But despite that limited volume, the catalytic dimension of this capital, the quality of this resources is really unique because it's flexible. You can take risks. You can do basically what you want with it as long as it's legal. Right. And so that is extremely precious when we're talking about transforming systems, because we need to innovate, we need to take risks, we need to do things differently. And so that's why we believe philanthropy has a key role to play. Unfortunately, the norm today, the default setting is relatively traditional, or even when it's strategic or more strategic with focus on impact, etc., it tends maybe to be a little narrow or a little short term or a little too project based, not collaborative enough. So what we're trying to do is, with all these members from everywhere in the world, listen, learn from the collective wisdom, from their experiences, and try to accelerate change within the sector so that we become better at partnering with governments, partnering with business, become better at being accountable, including to the communities we try to serve, and also working through trust and collaboration that really are key factors if we want to bring about systemic change, which is very different from achieving direct results, within 2 years with a project. So this is what we're doing, enabling environment. So the external environment, our own practice, including on climate, and I'll be happy to say more about climate, and also building the ecosystem. So building this infrastructure that can make all of that happen on the ground, especially in developing economies in Global South, where there's a particular need.
So a lot of ideas, I think, that we can dive into and explore there. One of the phrases that you used that caught my attention was, we want to fuel the transformation of philanthropy. And you talked about creating a community to do that. I often sort of feel that as we gather at these COP sessions, sometimes it's hard to understand where we're headed, or whether we're making enough progress, or we have enough speed to the progress that we're making. And one of the benefits that we can point to, even in the short term, is the creation of communities that can work together to try to advance what we're doing here. So that notion of creating communities seems to lie at the center of what Wings does. But as you think about the specific gap or space within the philanthropic world that had a need for a structure like Wings, how do you kind of define that space that you're in and sort of shape the unique role that Wings has versus other sort of philanthropic structures?
Well, I would say catalyzing and connecting and building movements. So that's what we're trying to do. It's not just delivering data or knowledge, but actually creating momentum. And I'll give the example of climate, since that's what brings us all here together. Wings, by definition, works across philanthropy issues, so policy, environment, etc., effectiveness. So we're not working on usually culture or health or any specific theme like that. But a few years ago, we really thought, given the level of and the scale and the emergency of this crisis, and the fact that it impacts everything, the whole of society, the whole of philanthropic work, we said it has become actually a sectoral issue for the field. Whether you work on climate or environment or not, you should care, and you should integrate that into your work. Mm-hmm. So when I said building movements, what we did is we actually supported our network members in Europe, in Canada, now in Brazil, in Indonesia, in different parts of the world, to launch a commitment targeting non-environmental, non-climate donors, to bring them on board and understand that working on climate doesn't mean abandoning what they're doing around education or around livelihoods, around community development, but on the contrary, that's a way to have more impact, to be more sustainable, and also to just play their part and their role in addressing these crises that could make all the philanthropic work around the world useless if we don't address that. So that's how we try to be a catalyst and work with these communities so that they all influence their own constituencies around the world, and we build a global movement. So today there are 670 foundations that have signed that commitment, and we have a lot of ideas on how to really accelerate change, share practices, and also create the coordination mechanisms and the collaboration mechanisms that are needed, especially on the ground at the local level, to accelerate change.
That's really interesting because sometimes it can feel like we're in an echo chamber where we spend a lot of time talking to the people who agree with us about these issues. But part of what you're describing is sort of going to foundations, going to philanthropic structures that have never thought about climate before and suddenly need to kind of integrate this into the work. For most of those groups, is this an easy transition to make, or is this difficult for them to understand?
Well, actually, we have a few colleagues here from our delegation in the room who could give you their perspective. But what I've perceived on that journey is that it seems very difficult. For example, our first conversations with our members in Brazil, when we said, why don't you create a commitment around climate for Brazilian foundations? The first reaction was like, oh, we have children that are not having meals, we have people in the streets, we have so many urgent issues. It's good climate, but let the big international foundations do that and work on the Amazon, but it's not our priority. And in the space of just a few months, this has totally, radically changed because of their involvement in this Philanthropy for Climate movement. And they brought a few of their Brazilian foundation members at the last COP, and they started having discussions. And yesterday, or the day before yesterday, they just announced the official launch of the first Brazilian commitment on climate. They've integrated that into their network strategy as a key priority, and it's becoming something major for them because they really saw this intersection and the fact it's not another topic. It's not, if I do climate, I don't do something else. They understood that it was at the heart of everything they were doing, and that will be a critical way to achieve more impact. And so I think it's challenging, but as long as if we manage to show how things are connected and how it's possible and needed to bring them together, then very quickly that can change.
So one of the big questions that we have at every COP is around financing, funding for climate-related initiatives. Because you're seeing these philanthropic structures respond to this climate message, do you feel that this is going to lead to more resources for climate initiatives in the future, that this is going to be something that helps us find ways to fund or to support the initiatives that we talk about at places, at events like COP?
Yes, that's the goal, and that's one of the reasons why we're here. We see it as an accelerator, and it raises awareness, it creates, and it brings energy for action. So that's one of the key reasons we're here. But I think that to make that shift and to bring it to scale, so not just like a few foundations or a few networks starting to really think about it, but to really move fast as we need. Of course, we need to continue campaigning and doing this kind of work, commitments, etc. But there's a piece which is never talked about and is absolutely critical to localization of international cooperation aid and the achievement of the SDGs is to have a strong infrastructure, a strong support system for philanthropy and for giving on the ground. And then again, I can give you an example around the Amazon. Right now, there are a lot of actors, including international actors, that want to send a lot of money to the Amazon for climate. And I'm sure that's the same for small islands, that there are a number of donors who are like, okay, there's a big problem there, including around adaptation. So we'd like to get some of the resources on the ground, but they don't know who can do it. So they would maybe go to a few big international organizations, but how do you reach communities? How do you reach these fishermen groups you were talking about who have the solutions? Or the indigenous people that have the knowledge, traditional knowledge, that can really make a huge difference. So how do we reach that? We need to have community funds, we need to have intermediaries, we need to have networks, we need to have collaboration mechanisms, we need data. So this whole infrastructure layer is absolutely critical and is never talked about. So one of the things we're really advocating for across the board, when we talk to governments or to multilateral development banks and of course to foundations, is like you need to invest in building that ecosystem because that's the only way that we're going to have a truly bottom-up, resilient, sustainable response to the situation.
Of course, when we think about sort of acting in the climate space, it's a very complex space. There's lots of places that we could be sort of directing our philanthropic efforts. As we think through things like, you know, resilience and adaptation and mitigation, are there elements of each of these areas that sort of appeal to different kinds of foundations or to different kinds of philanthropic structures? Where do you see the greatest interest from the groups that you're working with, and how do you help them kind of understand the nuances within the climate space as we think about these different issues?
So I think there are two different types of actors and strategies here in philanthropy. You have the actual climate foundations. And mostly these are a handful of massive US and European foundations that work in this field. Hewlett, SIF, IKEA, a few others that do incredibly important job. A lot of the focus is around mitigation. And there's, or even Bezos Earth Fund, Gates now, and technological innovation, mitigation, and so a lot of that money goes there. But that is just 2% of philanthropic investments around the world, the climate earmarked funding. And that's the type of work that they do. But from our perspective, as we try to engage with non-climate, non-environmental donors, these people, they absolutely do completely different things. They work with communities on education, on health, on livelihoods. That's what the bulk of foundations around the world are doing. The vast majority of the funds, they're more scattered, they're less concentrated, but that's really where we can make the biggest difference, and they have that proximity. So that's where we think that there's a lot of relevance to bring these players to understand and integrate climate, because they already are there at the community level, they already work on all these issues, and so if they really integrate that, they will be much more effective at helping these communities adapt, respond, prepare, and of course they will at the same time be able to contribute to the mitigation itself, because the two are very, and should be, I believe, interconnected. I think for me, mitigation and adaptation should go really hands in hands, and that's at the community level that can happen.
Excellent. So as philanthropic structures, foundations begin to work in these spaces, are there opportunities for them to help shape and guide government policy, the actions of larger private companies? What's the role that the philanthropic sector can play in leading other sectors to action?
Absolutely. That's a great point, and that's where we indeed see this very particular added value of philanthropic capital, is that it has the ability to test solutions and to leverage also not just its funding, but its expertise and its influence, its networks. And oftentimes, foundations have entry points to governments, to business, that traditional civil society or NGOs or local groups will not have. And so that's something they can bring, including in terms of shaping policy agendas based on best practices and innovations. We've seen that working in different places, and that's where we believe philanthropy is at its best, because again, with this small, limited philanthropic capital, they can have really a much more systemic effect by changing public policies. So that's something that is part of the change we need within the philanthropy field. And once again, that requires the infrastructure for it, because you need foundations to organize themselves so that they can extract the data that is needed, they can do the research work that is needed so that they can convince governments, and then that you have, the spaces, the mechanisms for learning and coordination and discussion with government, because otherwise it's not going to happen. Or if it happens one-to-one, one foundation for one government, it's going to be so slow. So we need, again, for that policy change to take place, to build the support ecosystem.
And maybe as we begin to sort of wrap this particular session up, a final question that sort of reflects back to where we started. For the 10-year-old me, the 10-year-old you, that sitting on a beach in rural Canada or in Nice in the south of France, I mean, these ideas can seem very far away. We're at a COP, we're talking policy changes, we're talking the organizations and operations of very large philanthropic structures. how do individuals in communities that are being impacted by climate change start to make the connections between what they can be doing on a day-to-day basis and the kind of high-level work that an organization like Wings is doing? I know there's a lot of intermediaries in that space, but what's the way in which we can start to engage at that local level in a fashion that supports your efforts, supports the work that you and your members are trying to do?
Well, that's a beautiful question. I would two things come to my mind. Well, the first one is going back to the meaning of philanthropy, love of humanity. That's for everyone. That's not just for rich people. That's not just for corporations. It's a mindset of reciprocity, mutual aid, generosity. That is something that belongs to everyone. And if everyone engages in this mindset in their own way, at their own level, with their own context and lives, I don't know what will happen, but change will happen, because that's fundamental if we want to address climate and other existential issues, that we really become generous, empathic societies. So that's number one. Second, again, I mentioned a bit earlier the importance of community funds. One of the ways to build this agency at the community level, and not make these groups and local NGOs and local associations of farmers or fishermen, etc., just mere implementers of international donors or even government, but have their own agency. One of the big pieces of that equation is, well, there's capacity, but there's also ability to generate, manage, and sometimes distribute resources. So you have a world of community funds, community foundations, social environmental funds, indigenous funds, women's funds, etc. And that piece of the ecosystem, I think, is absolutely essential to, again, bringing that proximity to action and having the change led, by the communities themselves and supported by international actors through this whole abstract chain of infrastructure we were talking about.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Before our conversation, this was a space that I knew very little about, and I really appreciate you walking me through this, sharing some of your thoughts and insights and ideas for the love of humanity. That was an interesting way to sort of package all of this together and explain why we do the things that we do in this space. So thank you, Benjamin, for spending this time and for being a part of this particular session.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, everyone.